So I'm very excited to introduce Cynthia Prescott. She is an associate professor of history at the University of North Dakota. She's the author of Pioneer Mother Monuments, Constructing Cultural Memory, and Gender and Generation on the Far Western Frontier. Her website, Pioneer Monuments in the American West, which I will share that link in the chat function, features interactive maps and timelines with more than 200 monuments. This is supported by a Whitting Foundation Public Engagement Seed Grant, and she is using the GIS-enabled map Clio to create detailed historical entries and walking tours of 200 sites in the West, with an emphasis on controversial public monuments and shifting representations of race and gender. So we're so excited to learn more from Cynthia. Again, you are more than welcome to ask questions through that chat function. I'll keep an eye on Facebook as well, as if anyone wants to ask questions on Facebook. So thank you so much for joining us. Cynthia, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here with all of you today. And this is a presentation we were talking about I was talking about with the staff at the museum a year or more ago. And at that time, I thought I was a little bit out there perhaps in talking about controversy in connection with pioneer monuments. But our world has changed dramatically in the past 12 months. And suddenly these monuments have become really much more in the public eye than they were even a few months ago. And so we're going to look at a longer history today of how we got to where we are today. And I want to stay up front. I know there have been some questions about how controversial my presentation will be. I want to make clear that my position here is as a historian. I'm going to talk about the research that I have done on how the pioneer monuments in Colorado came to be and how public reception, public attitudes and responses to those monuments have changed over time. I am not here to tell you what to do with your monuments, but to help you think about aspects of those monuments that maybe you weren't aware of before today. So that's kind of where we're sitting today. So we're going to look at some monuments, and this is drawn from my larger research project, my book, Pioneer Mother Monuments, Constructing Cultural Memory. And but we'll focus on monuments that are located in Colorado, particularly in Colorado Springs and Denver. Okay, so the earliest monuments to pioneers, and by this I mean statues, public statues depicting white Western settlers. The earliest of these were erected in beginning about 1885, and most of them are located in the west of the Mississippi River, but there are some scattered throughout the country. Among the first and most prominent of these was San Francisco's Pioneer Monument, which was dedicated in 1894. You may be more familiar with statues of pioneer mothers, which we'll talk about in a moment. But these earliest monuments, many of them depicted a trajectory, a historical process of white settlement. And they were universally laudatory of white Western settlement. This one from San Francisco depicted a hierarchy, a process of settlement from early European exploration of California up through white Anglo-American settlement in the late 19th century. Shortly after San Francisco erected this really popular, well-received monument, some business leaders in Denver decided that Denver, Colorado deserved its own pioneer monument. They envisioned an elaborate fountain that would depict pioneer life in Colorado and celebrate the coming of white society, white civilization, as they termed it in the early 20th century. So many of you may be familiar with the Pioneer Monument located near, just adjacent to the Civic Center in Denver, Colorado. The original design by a prominent artist named Frederick McMonnies called for statues around the base of a pioneer mother, a prospector, and a settler, homesteader. And then depictions of other Western wildlife. And at the top of the monument, the original intention was to have a statue of a Plains Indian warrior, a Native American man, on horseback. The artist intended this fountain design to represent the coming of white civilization to Colorado. And the monument was intended to also mark the end of the Old Smoky Trail, which settlers traveled overland to reach Denver and the surrounding area. But the people of Denver were outraged by Frederick McMonnies' design because they read this monument in a traditional fashion. They expected that, like the San Francisco monument put up a few years earlier, that there would be a trajectory from early settlement up through the top cell of the central spire was supposed to celebrate white civilization. But on the Denver monument, McMonnies depicted this in reverse order. So he placed settlers down here at the bottom of the monument and a Plains Indian warrior, a Native American man at the top, to indicate a progression in his mind from Indian savagery to white civilization, using language at the time. Okay. But people in Colorado read it differently. They saw this monument the way that they expected it to read, the way the one in San Francisco and others in other cities, Salt Lake City, for example, had, in which the top of the central pillar was the epitome, the thing you were celebrating the most. And so they saw this not as showing a progression or trajectory from savagery to civilization. Rather, they saw this as showing Native people dominating whites. Okay, it inverted what they presumed to be a proper racial hierarchy, placing whites at the bottom and Native Americans at the top. And they found this very problematic. And so there was a lot of discussion in the press. There's large public controversy, and even someone on trial for his life used his last words in the courtroom to call for a change to the monument. This is how much people cared about it at the time. And so Frederick McMonnies, the sculptor, agreed to revise his design, and he removed the Native American man from the top of the pillar and replaced it with a depiction of Kit Carson on horseback. So Kit Carson was a Western explorer and frontiersman, mountain man. His relationships with Native Americans is really complicated. He had operated a fur trade post. The historical record suggests that he had partnered with, if not formally married, 2 different Native American women. But he also was involved in the forced removal of Native people from the Four Corners region. And so at the time that this statue was designed, Carson was perceived more as an Indian fighter than as someone who was actually interested in interracial cooperation. So Kit Carson, as an Indian fighter, replaced the Native American warrior at the top of the monument, and that made this statue acceptable to the people of Denver. And this is then the final monument that was erected. Okay. After World War I, so in the 1920s, there's a shift nationwide in pioneer monuments, away from these elaborate towers of white civilization, white supremacy, I would argue, to depicting white women typically walking westward, or occasionally seated and resting from their labors on the frontier. I'm showing 2 of the most commonly known, most widely known of these. On the left side of your screen, we have Bryant Baker's Pioneer Woman, which was selected in a nationwide competition and erected in Ponca City, Oklahoma. And then on the right, you see Madonna of the Trail, sculpted by August Heimbach. And this is the image that's probably the most familiar to many of you, because Madonna of the Trail was erected by the Daughters of the American Revolution to mark Western trails across 12 states, stretching from Maryland to California, including one located in Lamar, Colorado. So these depictions of, I like to think of it as grandma in a sunbonnet, became very popular. There were dozens of them erected across the country. There are far more of these, in fact, than there were of these towers of white civilization. And these are put up across the country in the 1920s and 1930s, either with women accompanied by their children, as we see in these images, or occasionally as a pioneer family, more like a nuclear family image. Now here I want to pause and point out that these monuments are going up at very much the same time that better known Confederate monuments were being erected in the South. Okay? Most of the Confederate monuments that are controversial today that people are seeing as being symbols of white supremacy were erected in the era of Jim Crow between the 1890s and the 1920s, exactly when these pioneer monuments are going up. And these pioneer monuments are being erected with very much similar attitudes. These statues themselves might seem pretty innocuous, right? That's grandma in a sunbonnet after all. But if you dig into the documentary record, if you look at the speeches that were given at their dedication, if you look at the treatment that they received in the local press when these statues went up, it becomes more and more apparent that the people who were putting these up in the 1920s explicitly intended them to celebrate the coming of white civilization at a time when Native Americans were being increasingly contained onto reservations, at a time when the Eastern United States is very concerned, the Northeast is very concerned about immigration, so-called new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. There's a great deal of xenophobia around the nation. And these pioneer monuments are part of that larger conversation about who do we want to celebrate, who belongs here and who doesn't. And the message they're sending is very clear, that white women are carrying Euro-American civilization, meaning Christianity, US federal law, and policies that were favorable to whites and less favorable to anyone who was not of Western European descent. That is what they're intended to celebrate. So while they might seem like a friendly nod to the mother or grandmother of residents of these Western towns, and on one level they are doing that, right? They are celebrating ancestors who had worked hard, who suffered on the trail west, came west by covered wagon and established towns and cities in the West. There's a racial subtext going on here that was in many cases quite overt, in other cases somewhat less explicit, but it's always part of the cultural milieu in which these statues are coming from. And it would have been very apparent to people at the time that that was what was going on. Less apparent to us maybe today. These Pioneer Mother monuments were erected throughout the 20s and even through the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl era. But after World War II, depictions of solo Pioneer Mothers became far less common. Pioneer monuments more generally, there's fewer of them placed decades after World War II. And those that are placed, erected in Western towns and cities, generally depicted nuclear families rather than a woman in a sunbonnet carrying her children west. Okay, so I had promised you controversy, and here's our next controversy. In the 1930s, when those Pioneer Mother monuments were still popular throughout the country, the state of Texas decided to stage an elaborate celebration of the centennial of the formation of the Texas Independent Republic. So a centennial of Texas independence from Mexico and the United States, short-lived though it was. And so in the midst of the Dust Bowl era, they decided to put on a lavish party and to erect public monuments, including statue for Women's College campus in Denton, Texas. And this was supposed to celebrate pioneer mothers. A learned committee of men were chosen to select design, and the design that they chose was this one, William Zorrach's Pioneer Family. Now, think for a moment back to those pioneer mothers we were talking about a moment ago. Okay, we're used to seeing grandma in a sunbonnet. But the people of Texas were presented with this design. If you were in their shoes in the 1930s, what would you think? So first of all, they were concerned about there being a pioneer family, right? They were expecting a solo woman or perhaps marching west with a child. More problematic, of course, is that the pioneer family is nude. Nudity for women's college campus was problematic from many people's perspective. And without clothing, how are we to know that these are pioneers? Right? It's the long prairie gown and apron and sunbonnet that marks a pioneer woman, and rough homemade clothing or perhaps fringed buckskin for pioneer men. So the people of Texas were not, perhaps not surprisingly, shocked and a bit appalled by this design. They were outraged. To give just one example, the president of the Federated Women's Clubs of San Antonio sent a telegram to the Centennial Commission, outraged and saying that you can't do this. And the committee backed off and replaced that design with this sculpture, which was the one that was actually erected in Denton, Texas, by Leo Friedlander, another well-known sculptor at the time who had a reputation by this time for sculpting pioneers and pioneer women. Note that, okay, first of all, we have her clothed. This is not a pioneer family, but she is stripped of the husband and even of the children, and no rifle on hand, right? And she's sculpted in white marble, lest there be any questions about her purity and morality. So this monument was erected in Texas in the 1930s, but the Zorrach sculpture was still, that was the original selection for Texas for this purpose, was still respected by artists, the fine arts community, if not by the general public in Texas at the time. And so as pioneer family monuments became more popular after World War II, banks in Colorado decided to revisit Zorrach's sculpture. And they had his pioneer family sculpted, recast in heroic size in bronze and placed in front of their bank branches in Colorado Springs and Pueblo, Colorado. And they stood there for the next 20 or 25 years or so. And in the 1960s, the bank was heavily involved in celebrating their investment in art. This statue was featured prominently in their newspaper advertising at the time, arguing that a bank that could invest in such beautiful art could clearly be trusted with your financial investments in the bank. So this statue, which had been outrageous in Texas in the 1930s, was much more accepted in Colorado Springs by the 1960s. In part because it was stripped of the pioneer moniker. Calling it the family rather than the pioneer family places an emphasis on the familial relationships that had originally appealed to that selection committee in Texas, and emphasized the artistic elements rather than the pioneer narrative. In addition, avant-garde art had become much more popular, much more widespread in the years after World War II, and had gained more widespread acceptance in Colorado and across the nation by the mid-1960s. So what had looked suspect in the 1930s, right? Not only for its nudity, but for its more artistic license with the human form, right? Stylistically, it's informed by primitivism. It also evoked in the 1930s Soviet socialist realist art of the time. By the 1960s, this seems much safer than was where the avant-garde cutting edge of fine arts, the fine arts community had gone by the 1960s. One of the only actual monuments designated as a pioneer monument erected in the 1960s in Colorado was the one you see on your screen on the right by Susan Pugziba, dubbed Homage to the Pioneer. Now, this was selected by a committee of learned folks intended to celebrate pioneers and selected to be placed in a real estate development near downtown Denver. The artist insisted that she did not intend this to depict pioneers. And in fact, the title was not original to the piece. Pugziba argued that she had just been playing with forms and this is what came out. And this, by the way, is the front of the monument I'm showing you, not the reverse. This is as representational as this monument gets. But I've paired it here with a pioneer family monument from my home state of North Dakota from 1947 to suggest to you why people in Denver in the 1960s saw this as a pioneer monument. First of all, they've been surrounded by pioneer monuments for decades. And secondly, it evokes the kind of family relationship that the Abram Fairbanks piece you see on your left of your screen represented, as well as capturing sort of human relationships. It also was viewed by Denverites as evoking the mountains, the Rocky Mountains to the west of downtown Denver. So this also seemed to sort of evoke a place-specific expression of Colorado pioneer life. Pioneer monuments became less popular, as I suggested, after World War II, up until the 1980s and 1990s. So in the last 40 years or so, pioneer monuments have seen a resurgence in popularity. Indeed, out of the 200 pioneer monuments I have located throughout the United States, 50 of them were, or 25% of them, were erected since 1980. So this is for all that we think of them as being a phenomenon of the 1920s and 30s, many of them, an equal number, have been erected in recent decades. Recent monuments tend to celebrate nuclear families or occasionally the solo pioneer mothers, again, often wearing a sunbonnet. And like this one in Westminster, Colorado, and which also appears in several other locations in Colorado and throughout the West, they tend to emphasize promise or the hard work of white settlers. And as such, they celebrate the survival of the hard work and survival of those who came west, particularly those who came west in covered wagons and settled in Colorado and beyond. So these are images of homesteaders who are working together to survive in a harsh environment. Many of them have been placed as part of what I would argue is a phenomenon of heritage tourism. They are placed in front of city halls, not so much in large cities like in Denver anymore, but instead in suburbs or newer suburbs or bedroom communities on the outskirts of larger Western cities and Midwestern cities, outside Denver, outside Chicago, and so forth. And I would argue that they're part of trying to historicize a community that's much more recent. They also have been placed in front of historical museums, particularly new construction brand new buildings that are state of the art in terms of their storage for artifacts and in their interpretation of artifacts, but placing a bronze monument to a pioneer in front of a museum that tells the history of early white settlement helps to kind of evoke a historical time period. So for example, this sculpture by Verrill Goodnight called A New Beginning stands in front of the school where the school groups enter, the side entrance to the History Colorado Center in Denver. It is a tribute to Colorado school teachers and also celebrates opportunities for independence and, as the title suggests, a new beginning for women who came west. Notice here that this is a more, dare I say, feminist depiction of Western women. Instead of depicting a woman in a prairie gown and sunbonnet carrying her children westward, we see a smart young woman who has chosen to come west by railroad and to start anew. So different depictions of Western women, of gender relations in the West in solo pioneer women monuments, but also very typical and images of pioneer families that evoke monuments that were put up nearly 100 years earlier. Now, recent pioneer monuments are also not without controversy. One of the most controversial was this one, which was donated to the city of Portland, Oregon, to mark the 150th anniversary of the Oregon Trail. So we see here a fairly typical depiction of a pioneer family with a couple of exceptions. Rather than having a young daughter or a baby in arms, here we have the mother holding a rag doll, which evokes a daughter who died on the trail and more broadly evokes the hardships of the trail. It was not, when it was designed in 1993, by the way, it was not intended to evoke a family taking a selfie, but this is what people tend to see today when we look at it. But otherwise, the iconography is quite similar. Dad, mom, strapping young son, carrying books or a Bible westward. We have a rifle, a wagon wheel, all are sort of typical imagery of the West. And the Oregon Trail is an important historical event and phenomenon in the state of Oregon. So what's the problem with this monument? Well, some in the fine arts community questioned the artistic skill involved in this work, but the larger controversy was about the title. By calling it The Promised Land, artist David Manuel evoked older ideas about manifest destiny, about whites being called to settle and displace Native peoples in the West. And in Portland, which by the early 1990s already had a strong reputation for being a politically progressive place, this evoked significant controversy. This is happening, and this monument comes up also around the same time as the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' arrival in the Western Hemisphere. And so there were also larger debates about what we today might label settler colonialism. What stories should we tell about white explorers, about white settlers in North America? And so this monument became controversial for those reasons. It was moved around within Portland for several years before they finally settled on a location in Chapman Square, where I think the sense at the time was, well, we can kind of hide it in plain sight because nobody pays any attention to Chapman Square. But in doing that, they neglected to notice that Chapman Square had, by that time, 100 years of history of being a location of contestation over inclusivity within society. There had been anti-Chinese riots on that site in the 1880s. There had been contestation about working women having their own space to avoid sexual harassment on their lunch hour in the 1920s, and so forth. And more recently, it has become a vibrant part of the economic district, financial district in downtown Portland. And the building behind that is the Justice Center, the local jail, and there are federal buildings to each side. And This year, this monument and Chapman Square and the Justice building behind it have become the center of the Black Lives Matter protests that have been making national news in Portland. So it's once more in the news, and there have been protesters who have been caused either hanging signs or even causing damage to this statue this year, in the last couple of months. Okay, well, what about in Colorado? Well, Colorado Springs is not without controversy either. There was a proposal by a local pioneer heritage organization to place a pioneer monument in front of the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum, where we would all be sitting were it not for a global pandemic right now. So instead, you all are joining me from across the country, which is great. But the Pioneers Museum was going to be the location was a proposed location for a very traditional depiction of Western settlement. The initial proposal was for a concrete Conestoga wagon, which was going to depict early white settlement. But as that proposal came forward, right around the turn of the new millennium, that was coming on the heels of controversies like the one I was just talking about in Portland. And so there was pushback within the Colorado Springs community saying that Colorado Springs did not need yet another tribute to covered wagons and homesteaders. And so instead of the original design of a covered wagon and settlers moving west, there was a design competition in which there was an effort made to select something that would be more inclusive, not celebrating white supremacy, but celebrating diversity in Colorado Springs. Follow the Setting Sun by Harriet Lee. This is the design that was chosen. And this monument has itself not been without controversy. There have been questions about whether this is intended to be an evoking a secret society or some other kind of conspiracy theory. But the artist intended it to evoke the Rocky Mountains and the setting sun behind the mountains. That's the reason for the pyramidal shape. The imagery that you can see it if I draw on here. This imagery here is imprinted on the stainless steel, and it depicts Colorado Springs history from Native Americans prior to European contact through early Western settlement and up through the present day when it was erected in 2005. So including references to the Air Force Academy and cell phones. It was intended then to represent a more inclusive narrative of the West. Now, I will point out that even by framing it in those terms, if you delve into what each image is that's actually included in this design, the emphasis is still on white settlement, and it's still a sort of triumphal celebration of a trajectory from Native Americans in the past to white-led technology in the present and the future. So that narrative of white progress toward white achievement is still present in that image, the imagery imprinted in the pyramid. Also, I think for most people looking at this, you don't look at this and say, oh, that's a tribute to pioneers, or that's a tribute to Colorado Springs history, right? Instead, as you can see from this photograph, it reads from a distance more as just a pretty design. Now, the most impactful way that imagery shows up is if you were to view this monument at night, in which case it would be lit from within, and you would see the designs more clearly than you can in the daylight. But even then, it reads as a very modern sculpture, far more than it does a depiction of pioneer imagery. Okay. So as I mentioned, that Portland monument has been controversial in recent years. so has the San Francisco Pioneer Monument, with which we started today. The Pioneer Monument, which I showed you earlier, was controversial for its celebration of white supremacy, and in particular, a portion at around its base called Early Days, which you see a detail of here, which depicted a Spanish missionary towering over a Native American man with a Mexican Californian cowboy in kind of to their rear. Native American activists have been protesting this monument for decades. In the early 1990s, at the same time that the Portland Promised Land statue evoked controversy, this monument also evoked controversy in San Francisco, and the city responded by producing an interpretive plaque. So even the language of that plaque proved controversial, but they eventually settled by committee on a plaque language, which they placed in front of the monument. Then fast forward 20 or 30 years, the landscaping around the monument grew up such that you can't really see the plaque very well anymore. You can see it a little bit on your screen there. But the Early Days statue remained in place with little attention paid to the attempt to explain what it was this depicted. And the plaque language explains the plight of Native Americans and the extent to which Native populations were devastated, first by the Spanish missions and later by Mexican and Anglo-American settlement, particularly in the years following the 1849 gold rush. But not much attention was paid to that interpretive plaque, and many activists felt that was not going far enough. And so they protested this monument, and that portion of the monument was removed in September of 2018. So as you can see on your screen now, the plinth, the base of that portion of the monument, the Early Days statue, remains in place. And for at least for now, the intention is for it to remain empty and to eventually erect a new plaque that explains why that base is empty and why the Early Days statue has been removed. Okay, this year, this controversy hit Colorado as well. As many of you are likely aware, the Black Lives Matter protests throughout much of the country reached Denver, and protesters pulled down a series of statues in Denver Civic Center, including a sculpture that was not very representational, just represented a human form, but the plaque dedicated it to celebrating Christopher Columbus. And so that was deemed problematic and was removed. Also, a Confederate monument, a Civil War monument not for the Confederacy, but for Union soldiers from Colorado, but which also included a plaque marking the Sand Creek Massacre, that was also removed by protesters. The city of Denver became concerned that other monuments in the region would also be attacked by protesters, and so they deemed the Pioneer Monument to be a likely target as well. And so about a month ago, they removed the Kit Carson statue from the top of that monument out of concern that it would be attacked not as the original design had been for being not racist enough, but precisely because it was designed to be a celebration of white supremacy. So that's kind of where we are now. And I imagine I've seen there are some questions coming in, so I want to leave time for those questions. If you would like to learn more about these topics, real quickly, ways that you can learn more. You can check out my book, Pioneer Mother Monuments, which is available readily in bookstore near you or Amazon. You can also check out for free my website, Pioneer Monuments in the American West. And the URL there is pioneermonuments.net. And I believe you'll see that in the chat screen and on Zoom as well. And I also am, my website features information about individual monuments. There's an interactive timeline and map that you can see at the screen capture here. And then I'm also placing virtual markers and creating virtual tours of these monuments throughout the West. So there are walking and driving tours I've created of pioneer monuments within the Denver area in particular, and then in Colorado more broadly. And you can follow this tour on foot or in your car, or you also can visit virtually from home. And that is theclio.com. Check that out. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up for any questions you might have.
Yes, so feel free again in the chat function to post any of those questions. I will share a couple of them now. So we have someone who asked, do any of the Zorak sculptures still exist?
Yes, good question. So the Zorak statues no longer stand in downtown Colorado Springs and Pueblo. The bank was sold in the 1980s, and the new owners were not interested in maintaining those statues. So the statues were then sold at auction. And the one from Colorado Springs, I hear, was in best condition, and it sold to a private collector. But the one from Pueblo was in rougher shape, has been restored, and is now available for viewing outside the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. So the photo I showed you is of it right by the parking lot, between the museum and the parking lot, and you can go check it out yourselves.
Excellent. What led to the 1980s resurgence of pioneer monuments?
Good question. I think there are a few things going on there. Part of it, as I think I suggested in my presentation, is that there's a resurgence in interest in heritage tourism in that time period. And so there are some communities that are seeing this really as a way of historicizing a place that's otherwise not historic, right? Putting a name on, oh, we're going to build a new subdivision, but we're going to call it Pioneer Crossing or something of that nature. And then a statue helps reinforce that this is really a historic place, right? So these are really post-war suburbs that are looking back to, oh, our roots are these early settlers from the 1850s or the 1870s, and we can look back to them and then put up a monument sort of celebrating that, I think, is part of it. Another part of that is that in 1976, the United States celebrated the National Bicentennial. And initially, the plan for the bicentennial celebration had been that they, in Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, they would have a big national birthday party. But in the midst of the protest movements of the 60s and 70s, and the rise of ethnic studies programs at universities and so forth, there was pushback that if you're telling one celebratory story in Philadelphia, that's not telling a story that includes everyone in America. And so instead of having one big party in one location, they decided to decentralize it and encourage local and state level historical societies and so forth to put on their own celebrations that made sense for them and that were more inclusive of people who had come after US independence, people of color and so forth, different ethnic groups, immigration stories and so forth. And so each community started telling their own stories. But there's an interest in telling our local stories, and some of these pioneer monuments were coming out of that sort of impulse. And there's a broader interest in, let's pay attention to our roots. Let's look at where we came from in the aftermath of that bicentennial. So I think that also played into it in that time period.
Okay. There is an observation that in the Fairbanks 1947 family, they said, from this angle, the father looks kind of like Lincoln-esque. Do you think that was intended?
I don't know how intentional that it was on Fairbanks' part. Avery Fairbanks sculpted pioneer monuments for 50 years, from the 1920s up through right before he was still working on it when he died in, I think it was 1980. And so there were a lot of them scattered around the country. He was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and active in Mormon heritage in particular. And so a lot of these monuments are depicting Mormon families. But whether you look at his statues that were intended to tell LDS or Mormon history or Gentile history, like the one I showed you from North Dakota, his pioneer figures all look the same for 50 years. So all the dads look like Lincoln, all the moms have a headscarf and are sort of long suffering. The strapping son changes in age, but otherwise they kind of look the same. And some of his sculptures include the framework of a log cabin in the background. So my suspicion is that, at least on a subconscious level, yes, the father depicts or evokes Abraham Lincoln, but I've never seen in all of his papers I've looked at, I've never seen any reference on his part that was intentional. I suspect it was a more subconscious thing.
Okay. This is a great question. Do you believe there is any way to create pioneer monuments without promoting the narrative of white civilization or racial hierarchy?
That is an excellent question, and I don't know that I have a good answer to it. One of my impulses is, well, we should include lots of different kind of imagery. And this is what they tried to do with the Follow the Setting Sun at the Pioneers Museum, right? To say, oh, we're going to tell lots of stories. But I think if we look at monuments elsewhere, we can see that there are problematic aspects of that. So for example, there's a famous one of a statue of Theodore Roosevelt from New York City in front of I believe it's the Natural History Museum in New York City, where he's depicted with people of color on either side of him, a Native American man and an African American man. And this is supposed to show Theodore Roosevelt's friendship with and devotion to these people of color. But Theodore Roosevelt is on horseback, and the two men of color on either side sort of flanking him look like servants, not like partners, right? And so that's another sculpture from the 1920s, right? 100-year-old sculpture that's been increasingly controversial. But I think it is informative in the sense that what we see as being representing inclusiveness today might not look that way in 50 or 100 years. So yes, I want it to be inclusive. I want it to not be an explicit racial hierarchy, but I think it's hard to figure out how we do that in a way that's going to be timeless, that's going to be read the same way in 100 years as it is today. And I think that anytime that we're depicting settlers on the landscape, there is at least a subtext that says, oh, yeah, they belong here. And the implication there is that then Native peoples who had lived in that region for generations, hundreds of years, deserve to be there less, right? And so it's hard for me to imagine a celebration of white settlers that doesn't somehow evoke the erasure or removal of Native peoples. I would like to see it happen, but I haven't been able to figure out what it would look like.
Mm-hmm. So looks like we have just a couple more questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
There was one comment that the Madonna of the Trail looks very masculine, and they suspect maybe to show that she's a very hard worker. Do you have any comment or?
A lot of people have commented on that she does look much more masculine than other pioneer mothers do, particularly the Ponca City one I showed you. The pairing, I think, makes it really obvious. I think it's partly to show that she's strong and hardworking. I also think that it's the sign of a not very skilled artist. So Leinbach was not a one of the upper echelon of fine artists like many of the others who like McMonnies and for the Denver sculpture, for example, Denver Pioneer Fountain, for example. Most of those monuments that were going up in that time period were done by really prominent artists or were essentially copies of those kinds of works. August Leinbach was not a particularly prominent nor well-trained artist. And so I think it's also partly his lack of skill and the fact that the material he's working with, which is a composite, basically poured concrete, is far less malleable than bronze or even marble might be.
Interesting. Okay. So another comment from the public, looking at your site, the South seems to lack pioneer monuments. Why do you think that is?
There are a few in the South. There's one in Western Florida, for example, and there are more in Kentucky, Tennessee, in the Upper South. And I think this has to do with racial politics and local identity, right? That if you're looking at the so-called Black Belt or Cotton Belt of the South, in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, the dominant narrative is of plantation agriculture and a memory of the Old South, right? These are the people who put up the Confederate monuments that are so controversial in many locations today. And they're not really, so there certainly were frontier eras in all of these places, right? There were times when there were early settlers, right? So, for example, Massachusetts has a monument that depicts their early settlers in very similar imagery to, although they don't use the term pioneers because doesn't evoke as much, right? We're thinking more about Pilgrims and Puritans than pioneers in Massachusetts. That pioneer narrative is powerful in the Appalachian South, right? In Kentucky and Tennessee, where narratives of small landholders, early white settlement in the region is much more powerful. But it just doesn't have much resonance, I think, for the Deep South, where narratives of the Old South are not really interested in talking about how once upon a time Alabama was a frontier. Right? They're much more interested in talking about a time when Alabama had a rich agricultural system built on cotton.
Mm-hmm.